All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome to our Advanced Physiology seminar presentation on the physiological adaptations in diving nomads, presented by myself, Stephen, and Olivia. So, as you would expect, this topic is going to cover the hypoxia section for this course. So, before we get started, let's quickly go through our talking points. So the first talking point we will discuss are the normal responses to apnea, specifically the acute and acclamatory responses to apnea, and also give a few experimental results to show the effects of those responses. Secondly, we will look at a quick history of the Bajau people and also give a brief explanation of their diving technique. Thirdly, we will look at the challenges that the Bajau people face when they free dive and also discuss their physiology. Fourthly, we will look at the genetics of the Bajau people and how they relate to their evolutionary adaptations. And then finally, we will give a fitting conclusion to our presentation. So now that that's out of the way, I will let Olivia discuss the first talking point, which is how normal people adapt to diving environments.
To begin, I will discuss how normal people adapt to the diving conditions acutely by looking at the mammalian diving reflex. Then, I shall discuss the acclamatory adaptations by looking at altered physiology of elite divers. We are going to ask Clara to perform an experiment, but since we are all home, we can't do so. I'll explain how it was to work though. Clara was to put her face in a bowl of room temperature water, and we would time how long she could hold her breath. We could monitor her heart rate using my EKG machine. She would then put her face in a bowl of cold water, and we'd take the same measurements. So, let's discuss what would have happened. First off, the mammalian diving reflex is an acute response that occurs when the face comes into contact with cold water. As such, it is meant to help the animal stay submerged underwater for longer periods of time and stave off drowning. The ability to remain submerged depends on the amount of O2 getting to the vital organs and to the brain. So, what we should have seen in Clara's results would be an increase in apneic time when she was in the cold water. So how the diving reflex works is as follows. First, if the person is not prepared for submersion, they will gasp for air upon contact with the water. This should help to fill the lungs with air. But there are several reports of this gasping reflex doing more harm than good, and actually causing people to inhale water. In most cases of diving, the person holds their breath and there is no gasp reflex. Second, the diving reflex induces bradycardia and peripheral vasoconstriction after about 30 seconds of submersion. We should have seen that Clara's heart rate is slower in the cold trial than in the room temperature trial. The bradycardia and peripheral vasoconstriction are meant to reduce the oxygen consumption, thus increasing the apneic time. In addition, there will be an increase in lactic acid in the plasma, and that will incur peripheral anaerobic respiration. Another component of the diving reflex is splenic contraction. The diving reflex causes the release of erythrocytes, that is to say red blood cells, from the spleen to the bloodstream. This increases the oxygen carrying capacity. It has been shown that serial assays result in longer apneas because the spleen would have already released the red blood cells. The spleen holds about 8% of red blood cells. That's about 200 to 250 milliliters. Low oxygen and high carbon dioxide can trigger splenic contraction. Another feature of the diving reflex is the release of erythropoietin, or EPO, from the kidneys. EPO stimulates the formation of erythrocytes, and this will increase the oxygen carrying capacity in the long term. Although I was disappointed in not being able to do a live experiment for us, I remembered that we had done this laboratory experiment in our Animal Physiology Lab 2 with Dr. Parsons. We had compiled the data from the different classes, and we were able to analyze it and come up with a graphical representation of what was occurring. We used 5 different bowls of water, one at 10, 15, 20, 25, and 30 degrees Celsius. Our results show a significant decrease in the percent change in the heart rate when it is at 15 degrees Celsius or below. There is no significant change at higher temperatures. This correlates strongly with our theory that the mammalian dive reflex is triggered in colder water. We can see that after 30 seconds there is a greater decrease in the percent change in heart rate than at 15 seconds. This also correlates with our theory that the bradycardia will be enacted after 30 seconds. Now, our graph is a little bit different than it should be because we have a very poor resolution, having only 5 points. What the graph should look like is a hockey stick curve with a plateau up until 15 or so degrees Celsius, and then a sharp decrease. We should have had more points in order to get this proper curve, but we did not. Something that is notable is that the males have a greater decrease in heart rate than the females. There is nothing in the literature that suggested why. That could be a starting point for future research. Now we will look at the acclamatory response. I looked at articles that studied elite divers since they are not genetically adapted to deep diving as the Bajau are, but instead have achieved success underwater through repeated exposure and training. This just shows how far the human body can go without having genetic predispositions. A study by Engen et al. Demonstrated that normal people who trained for 2 weeks with apneic training could increase the time they held their breath by 44 seconds. And that's only in 2 weeks. They saw other results, such as an increase in EPO blood levels. They had a faster onset of cardiovascular changes by 3 seconds. They had a lower heart rate at the end, and they had higher oxygen saturation post-apnea. That means that they used less oxygen throughout their apneas. The researchers did not see, however, an increase in hematocrit, and that is because that 2 weeks is too short. But they did find reticulocytes, which means that there is an increase in red blood cell production. Another group of researchers, Boutin et al., looked at the effects of 8 weeks of training. They found that apneic times followed a steep increase in the beginning, and then began to plateau. In 4 weeks, the time increased by 32%, but by the end of the 8 weeks, the increase was only 41%. They also showed that serial apneas were longer, which means that if you were to do 1, 2, 3, 4, one after the other, that the last ones would be much longer than the first. What's also notable in the results is that the hemoglobin concentrations and splenic volume increased, but the splenic contraction did not, meaning that the same amount of red blood cells was released, which means a 2% increase. Another group looked at the elite breath hold divers, and they found that there was no significant difference in splenic volume between them and untrained people. They also found no correlation between splenic volumes and the size of the person, but rather it was a correlation between the genetics and the spleen size. This is what Stephen will discuss in just a moment. They hypothesize that earlier on in training, the spleen may increase in volume, but later on in training, it will revert back to its initial size. So there were no splenic differences between the elite breath hold divers and the untrained people. However, there were some differences in those groups, and that accounts for acclamatory changes. So first off, there was an increase in hemoglobin and erythrocyte concentration. That means that the blood could carry a lot more oxygen in the elite breath hold divers than in the normal people. Furthermore, there was increased capillarization in the skeletal muscles, as well as a decreased diffusion distance. That is because the increase in capillarization means that there's more blood flow going to the muscles, and so that the oxygen has less far to travel. Additionally, there is more myoglobin in the muscles of elite breath hold divers than untrained people. That means it can have a higher storing capacity for oxygen, which they'll need if they're going underwater for quite a bit. Also, they have the ability to shunt more blood into the lungs and have a more dome-shaped diaphragm. That increases the pressure inside to sort of counteract the high pressure that they'll be getting from deep below the ocean. Furthermore, they also have a less sensitive reflex to breathe because they're less sensitive to the high carbon dioxide levels in their blood and the low oxygen levels in our blood. Now, normal people, when they have high carbon dioxide levels, like if you hold your breath for a while, you'll automatically feel that need to breathe. But the elite breath hold divers have been so used to this that they don't have such a heightened sensibility to that. So they can go for a longer time without breathing. An acute response to diving is the mammalian diving reflex. This is going to be incurred when your face meets cold water. After 30 seconds, your heart rate's going to lower, and you're going to have peripheral vasoconstriction to decrease your oxygen consumption. Afterwards, you're going to have splenic contraction, which is going to release about 2% of your red blood cells, which is going to account for 200 to 250 milliliters. And finally, you're going to have your kidneys release erythropoietin to increase your blood cell count, and that will help you in the future. So you're going to kind of like invest in blood cells. There are going to be some acclimatory responses to diving, and in 2 weeks, you can have a 44-second increase in apneic time. In 8 weeks, you'll have an increase as well, but you'll see that you're going to start to plateau, so it's not like you can hold your breath for an infinite amount of time. That makes sense, right? Then, finally, there's going to be the elite divers who have acclimatory responses such as an increase in red blood cell count, an increase in hemoglobin concentration, more capillarization and myoglobin in their muscles. And they're also going to have some physiological changes in their lungs to counteract the high pressures of diving. So these acclimatory responses should be seen in the Bajau. But not all of the Bajau's responses come from training. There are some responses that are innate and very different, and that is what Stephen will talk about.
So, before we get into the genetics portion of our presentation, let's look at a quick history of the Bajau people. So, there are multiple stories of how the Bajau people came to existence, but I will give you the most famous story right now. So, over 1,000 years ago, it was believed that the king of the Philippines lost his daughter to a flood, so she was swept out to sea. So, he ordered some of his villagers to go out to sea and find her. So, they went out to sea for several days to find her, but to no avail. Fearing the wrath of the king upon their return, they decided to live out the rest of their lives in the waters. And so, over the course of hundreds of years, we get the Bajau people that we know to this day. Now, it turns out that the Bajau people are not just a singular ethnic group, but several different ethnic groups located throughout the maritime Southeast Asian countries, which makes sense because they're sea nomads, so they travel through the waters all the time, so they land in different areas, so they're scattered across those countries. But they all follow the same lifestyle, which is that they spend most of their life underwater, up to 60% of their day. Bear in mind that humans are usually awake between 14 to 16 hours per day, so 60% of their day is quite a lot, between 7 to 8 hours underwater. Now, they spend a lot of hours underwater for two reasons. They search for fish, sea creatures, and as well as plants for consumption and trade. Trade with other communities in land regions for other necessary products like wood and rice. Now, because they live out in the waters, they're not going to swim all day, so they build houses on stilts above water, and they also travel through the waters by homemade boats called lepa. So now that we covered the modern lifestyle, let's look at their diving technique. Now, you might think, okay, there's something special about the Bajau people, so there must be a special technique for them to be able to dive so easily. Not really. They simply gasp for air, so they breathe in as much air as they can, and they jump in. And they hold their breath as long as they can. Very anticlimactic, I would say. Now, kids as young as 3 learn to dive, so that way they can provide for their family, and they do this for their whole lives. Now, they don't dive alone. They also use different tools to aid them, or facilitate their capturing of fish and other sea creatures, such as spears, homemade spear guns, and also homemade goggles so that they will be able to see underwater more easily. And they've used this technique for over 1,000 years, and it works. They can hold their breath for a very long time, up to 13 minutes, and they can dive as low as 60 meters underwater. Bear in mind that humans can only hold their breath for up to 2 minutes on average, and dive not that low underwater. And here is a video link for a journalist who dived underwater with 5 other Bajau kids up to 13 meters underwater. It's quite incredible to see how the kids easily dive and hold their breaths underwater, so I'd recommend watching it. Now, before we get into the physiological adaptations of the Bajau people, we first have to look at the 2 main challenges that they face when they dive. The 2 being changes in pressure on the ears and oxygen deprivation. So, to cover the first challenge, we first have to look at the anatomy and physiology of the ear. So, the ear has 3 main roles. The first being balance, second hearing, and third equalizing pressure. So for the purposes of this presentation, we're going to look at the last two functions, hearing and pressure equalization. So the ear is split into three main parts, the outer ear, middle ear, and the inner ear. Now, we're going to look at four main anatomical parts. The first is the ear canal. The ear canal is responsible for the entry point of all sound waves. So any sound wave you want to receive, it first has to pass through that canal. Second is the tympanic membrane, commonly known as the eardrum. Its role is to receive sound waves and transmit them to the auditory bones, or the ear bones, known as the malleus, incus, and stapes. Third, we have the cochlea. It will transform vibrations into a nerve impulse to transmit them through the vestibular nerve or the cochlear nerve to send it to the brain. And finally, we have the eustachian tube. The eustachian tube is a tube that is connected to the throat, and its role is to maintain pressure in the middle ear. So it's the main anatomical part that is responsible for maintaining equalization of pressure. So, how do we hear? Well, first, the sound wave will enter through the ear canal, here. The sound waves will then hit the eardrum or tympanic membrane. This will cause the eardrum to vibrate. The vibrations of the eardrum will continue through the ear bones, and eventually it will get into the cochlea. Now, vibrations in the cochlea are due to a fluid that's contained inside. So there's a fluid that will vibrate, and the vibrations from the cochlear fluid will cause a change. The change will be from vibration to a nerve impulse. So there are sensors in the cochlea that will transform the vibrations into a nerve impulse, and those nerve impulses will be then sent to the brain. That's how you will be able to hear. So now that we covered the hearing portion, we first have to look at how the eustachian tube equalizes pressure. So we are constantly exposed to changes in pressure. Sometimes you climb a mountain, sometimes you might be on a plane, sometimes you're diving underwater for fun. But it's thanks to the eustachian tube that your ear pressure always stays relatively equal. So, in this case, let's look at what happens when you dive underwater. So, when you dive underwater, water pressure increases. So there's a higher outer pressure pushing against the eardrum. So, and the further you dive, the higher the pressure is. Now, in order to make sure that the eardrum doesn't get damaged, the eustachian tube is responsible for pushing back against the pressure from the outside environment. How does it do that? Well, initially, the eustachian tube is closed. When your mouth is closed, the eustachian tube is closed. In order to open it, you have to contract the throat muscles. And how do you contract your throat muscles? Well, you open your mouth. By opening your mouth, the eustachian tube will open, the air will fill up inside the eustachian tube, and that will push back against the pressure from the outside region. Now, this is why when you're on a plane and you're starting to descend, people tell you yawn or pretend you're chewing gum. The reason why they tell you to do that is because you're contracting your throat muscles so that the eustachian tube opens so that it can equalize the pressure. But as you can imagine, you're diving underwater. You can't really open your mouth because you're holding your breath. So this is one challenge they have. And because they dive very deep underwater, they're exposed to high water pressure. So I will show you an example of how the Bajau people are exposed to high water pressure and how it affects their eardrum. So, as you can see here, a bunch of divers took a cup, they cut a balloon, and they attached it to the rim of the cup, and this acts as the eardrum. Now they're going to descend the glass underwater, and as you can see, the pressure outside, so the water pressure, keeps increasing, so it keeps pushing into the glass. That is what the eardrum feels every time you dive underwater and you go deeper and deeper underwater. And as you go back up, the pressure equalizes because the water pressure is lower at shallow levels rather than deeper levels. Now, here's the problem if you dive too deep. As you can see, the eardrum will rupture. And if the eardrum ruptures, water can get in the ear. Pressure is quickly equalized, but that means that the people that have ruptured eardrums are more exposed to infections, bleeding, and hear loss. So we want to avoid that. So in this image here, you can see, there's a hole now in the eardrum. The eardrum has been ruptured, So now when sound waves pass through the ear canal and hit the eardrum, only a portion of it will vibrate because some of the sound wave just passed through the hole or the rupture here. And what ends up happening is you have partial hearing loss or sometimes even go deaf. So how do the Bajau people adapt to high pressures in the ears? Is there some special mechanism? Well, no, they don't actually handle high pressures the way you might think. In fact, they intentionally perforate their eardrums. So what they do is they dive underwater as much as they can and as deep as they can in order to purposefully rupture their eardrums. So what ends up happening is most divers have some form of hearing loss, be partial or completely deaf. And the reason why they intentionally perforate their eardrums is that so they can dive without pain, because the further you dive, the pressure can become painful. So they want to be able to do their diving without going through that pain. As one Bajau diver said, "You bleed from your ears and nose, and you have to spend a week lying down because of the dizziness. After that, you can dive without pain." Now we'll look at the second challenge that the Bajau people have to face, which is hypoxia, specifically hypoxic hypoxia, which is where the partial pressure of oxygen in the arterial blood decreases. So the body's response to hypoxia is this. The carotid body, which is a cluster of specialized cells, will detect low oxygen presence in blood and send a signal to the brain. The brain will then respond by sending signals throughout the body to cause the vasoconstriction of the blood vessels within the lungs, increasing the heart rate and vasodilating the peripheral blood vessels. Now here you have the classic example of low oxygen pressure at high altitudes, but these responses also occur when someone holds their breath underwater. Another risk factor is free diving blackout. This is where the partial pressure of oxygen in the brain drops low enough for the person to fall unconscious, and this usually happens towards the end of a breath hold dive. Now people who fall victim to this will usually drown unless they are rescued or resuscitated within a short amount of time. Now you might think increasing the heart rate would increase energy expenditure and peripheral blood vessels would limit the Bajau's swimming ability, and that is true. So how have they evolved to adapt to hypoxic conditions? Well, it's something Olivia has discussed at the start, the diving reflex. It will temporarily reverse the physiological effects of hypoxia, be it decreasing the heart rate and actually increasing vasoconstriction to the necessary skeletal muscles, so the arms and legs for the Bajau to properly swim. But the main focus is right here, splenic contraction. So the spleen has two main functions. It is split into two main parts, the white pulp and the red pulp. The white pulp has the role of adaptive immune responses, so it plays a critical role for the immune system, and the red pulp is a blood reservoir and also has a role of filtering blood. The main focus will obviously be on the red pulp for oxygen. So the spleen will actually contract to release stored red blood cells in the red pulp in hypoxic conditions. Unfortunately, the mechanism of how the spleen contracts is unknown. However, we can still visualize it with the aid of our good friend, the northern elephant seal. Back in 2001, a group of researchers tried to mimic, or at least simulate, the diving conditions for a northern elephant seal. So they took a diving helmet, filled it up with water to fully submerge the seal's face to mimic the diving conditions. After every minute, they take a CT scan to observe the volume of the spleen and also the blood flow of the liver. So as you can see here, this is the volume of the spleen at the start, and this is the blood flow of the liver. As you can see, there's very minimal. Now, over the course of a few minutes, you can see that the spleen volume actually decreases. This is the spleen contraction, and you can see that the blood flow in the liver actually gradually increases over time. This is further proven with this graph right here. So over the course of 2 minutes, you can see a statistically significant difference in spleen volume. So you can see that it decreases quite rapidly after 2 minutes. And this is also further proven with the hematocrit level. At the start, the hematocrit level is quite normal, and after simulating the diving conditions, you can see that there's a statistically significant increase in the hematocrit percentage. The hematocrit percentage being the volume of red blood cells compared to the total blood volume. And also, you can see that in the post-diving conditions, the hematocrit level drops back to normal quite rapidly over the course of 10 minutes. So what do the Bajau people have in terms of alterations to their spleen? Well, they have an enlarged spleen, splenomegaly. It turns out that the average volume of blood that an average person can carry is up to 250 milliliters. But with this enlarged spleen, they can carry more. Unfortunately, we don't know how much more. Now, we want to know, how did the Bajau people actually gain this characteristic, or this evolutionary trait? And this is what Stephen will be talking about next. He will talk about how the genetic changes in the Bajau people led to their evolutionary adaptations and traits.
Well, hello everyone. In this third section of this presentation, I'm going to be focusing with you on the genetic adaptations in particular human groups, particularly the Bajau, which enhance their physiology for apneic diving. So what are we waiting for? Let's dive in. So first of all, just what am I talking about when I say a genetic adaptation to physiology? Basically what I'm talking about are traits that have been selected for which improve a given population's ability to perform long apneic dives. And I personally find this subject quite interesting and very exciting, really. We tend to think of selection as this long ago in a land far away. But here we see an example of selection of a particular polymorphisms which have been taking place in a given population over just the past few thousand years, and in our own species. Unfortunately, the subject has remained rather obtuse, and there hasn't been a lot of research on it for many years. In 2018, however, novel research was published by Alardo et al., who announced that they had described just such an adaptation in the Bajau people, whom we've been talking about here today. In particular, Alardo was interested in determining if a diving population such as the Bajau would have positive selection for genes which would increase their spleen size. She later said in an interview about her work, and you've got the quote on the slide right there, "I thought that if selection acted on the seals to give them larger spleens, it could potentially do the same in humans." Before we continue, I'd just like for you to hear what Alardo et al. Say about their own work in the form of their video abstract, what they made on their article. The article is available online, and so is the video abstract, so if you want to go back and watch this later, it's available. But let's just watch that.
Hypoxia is an important issue in medical contexts ranging from COPD to critical care. Many studies of hypoxia response in humans have focused on populations living at high altitudes. These populations represent a sort of natural experiment to teach us about the ways the body can adapt and evolve to tolerate low oxygen conditions. One thing all these populations have in common is that they undergo chronic hypoxia. We instead turn to a population that undergoes acute hypoxia. The Bajau of Southeast Asia, sometimes called sea nomads, are an extraordinary group of people. For thousands of years, they have existed as marine hunter-gatherers, making their living and surviving entirely off the sea. They survive in part through breath-hold diving, and they are exceptionally good at this. It was entirely unknown whether the sea nomads' abilities had a genetic basis. Using ultrasound measurements and a comparative whole genome study, we demonstrated that natural selection has acted on the Bajau's diving abilities through a number of traits related to the human dive response. One component of the human dive response is contraction of the spleen. This pushes a supply of oxygenated red blood cells into the system, providing an oxygen boost. Seals with high dive capacity, like the Weddell seal, have disproportionately large spleens. We found that the Bajau, both divers and non-divers, have significantly larger spleens than their close geographic and genetic neighbors, the Salawan. Through a selection scan, we identified a genetic variant under selection in the Bajau in the gene PDE10A that is associated with spleen size, which we confirmed in a European cohort. PDE10A is involved in the regulation of thyroid hormone levels. In mice, it has been shown that low levels of the thyroid hormone T4 decrease spleen size, an effect which is reversible through an injection of T4. So it seems that the large spleens of the Bajau might be the result of increased thyroid hormone levels. We found a number of other candidates under selection in the Bajau with potential relevance for diving, including in the gene BDKRB2. This gene is associated with another component of the human dive response, peripheral vasoconstriction. A decrease in the size of the blood vessels in your extremities helps to preserve oxygen for your vital organs. Our results indicate that the Bajau, and likely other diving populations, represent an entirely new system for studying hypoxia.
Wow, well, quite a mouthful. Let's just take it one step at a time, though. First of all, how did they come to the selection of these different people groups? Well, Mehdi's already told us about the Bajau and how they have a long diving history, and how they've also been isolated from other tribes. There's not a lot of genetic drift between them and other tribes. This makes them ideal for trying to find genetic polymorphisms which would have been selected for in the Bajau people over the past few thousand years. On my right over there you can see a graph assembled by what they call principal component analysis. Now you don't need to know what principal component analysis is or how to do one or anything like that. What you should know is that the distance between the dots indicates the degree of relatedness between different people groups. So two dots which are closer together and the branch point is closer are more closely related than two dots which are further apart. So you can see, if you can find the Bajau on this graph, that one of the closest relatives of these people is the Saluan tribe. And since the Saluan are non-divers and also largely isolated from the rest of the world, the researchers used them for the comparison. The Han Chinese, whom I believe are labeled CHB on this graph, were used as the outgroup if you're interested. We've also seen already why the spleen is a particular interest. Both Mehdi and Olivia have told us about how the spleen is involved in storing red blood cells, which can be released during the dive reflex. It was thought that genetic polymorphisms which increase spleen size would consequently be selected for in a diving population. So Lardo began by doing ultrasounds on 59 randomly selected Bajau nomads and 34 Saluan individuals to determine whether their spleens actually differed in size. And it should be no surprise, the Bajau did have larger spleens, on average. Well, there is a small problem. And if you've been tracking with us up to date, you'll know that, as Olivia told us, trained divers are already known to have enlarged spleens. So it's no surprise that the Bajau have larger spleens than the Saluan. The Bajau are divers and the Saluan are not. Of course, Laura knew this, so she statistically compared Bajau divers with non-divers. Interestingly, and conveniently for their study, there was no statistical difference between the spleen size in the Bajau people between the divers and non-divers. While it is surprising, it did allow Alardo to dive deeper and to try to find out what genetic adaptations, what genetic differences exist between the Bajau and the Saluan. I'm going to cover this slide really quickly since it's actually more fun than useful. But suffice it to say that what they did is they did a phenotype first, as opposed to a genotype first, genome-wide association study between the two groups to find genes showing high-level selection in the Bajau. So basically what they're doing is they're trying to find genes which are demonstrating positive selection in the Bajau as compared with the Saluan. And when the dust settled, they were left with a list of 25 single nucleotide polymorphisms, SNPs, which appear to have been under selection in the Bajau people. Of course, many of those genes are involved in the immune response, right? The particular microbiome that the Bajau live in as compared with the Saluan. And for the sake of this study, they eliminated those. They ignored those. So they were left with only a few genes that were actually of major interest to the study. And the most interesting hit for Lardo was an SNP in a gene known as PDE10A, whose full name is cyclic AMP and cyclic AMP inhibited, cyclic GMP, 3', 5', cyclic phosphodiesterase 10A. Whew! I said it. Well, I don't expect you to be able to pronounce or understand that full title. But what you should know is that PDE10A is involved in a signal transduction pathway. And ultimately, it regulates thyroid hormone release. Again, and you're probably wondering, what does that have to do with anything? Fascinatingly, not in humans, but in mice, scientists had already shown that thyroid hormones correlate with spleen size. Higher thyroid hormone levels raise the spleen size in mice. And to verify that that was actually what was happening in the Bajau, Ilardo started studying this SMP in European populations. So Ilardo examined the spleen size of Europeans with this polymorphism as compared with Europeans with other polymorphisms. And as you probably guessed by the very fact that we're having this discussion, they were dead on. So this demonstrated that PDE10A increases thyroid hormone levels, which consequently increases spleen size in the Bajau people. And interestingly, PDE10A also regulates splenic smooth muscle contraction, which could be another way that it also assists in diving response. I'm going to zip over these last 3 slides since they're not really the focus of Ilardo's research. But in their study, they do mention SMPs in 3 other genes of interest, which show positive selection in the Bajau. The first of these is BTKRB2, bradykinin receptor B2, which is a 7-transmembrane domains receptor. You've got one depicted over my head, which is involved in smooth muscle spasm, vasodilation, and edema. The functions hint to us that this SMP could be selected for in the Bajau to help with the dive reflex, right? I mean, what was that? Vasodilation and muscle spasm, it all hints at dive reflex, especially when we're comparing it in the Bajau people and we're seeing a positive selection. But what's really fascinating about this particular gene is that it was already shown in studies to affect the dive reflex. It's one of the few genes that is known to directly affect the dive reflex. Well, the third gene of interest here is CACNA1A, the subunit which forms the pore in a particular voltage-gated calcium channel involved in glutamate release. Now you're probably wondering again, what does that have to do with apneic diving? And my answer is, I have no idea. And neither do the scientists. But it is known that this gene is upregulated in response to hypoxia-inducible factor 2A. Maybe it's just a coincidence, but we do know that certain versions of this gene are selected for in the Bajau nomad, and this gene is upregulated in response to HIF2A, hypoxia-inducible factor 2A. The fourth and final gene with polymorphism which is selected for in the Bajau people is FAM178B. Again, its apneic role is not known. What we do know is that it normally forms a stable complex with carbonic anhydrase. The product of this gene forms a stable complex with carbonic anhydrase, which in its turn regulates bicarbonate and carbon dioxide levels, which suggests that FAM178B may play a role in preventing carbon dioxide buildup and in regulating pH during the dive reflex. But again, the function is not fully elucidated. And really, in closing, honestly compels me to remind you, Ilardo only elucidated the full mechanism of the first of these 4 genes, which is the focus of her study. That is PDE10A, phosphodiesterase 10A, which increases spleen size by increasing thyroid hormone levels. Ilardo and others have suggested possible reasons why the other 3 genes and various genes may demonstrate selection in the Bajau, but in reality, any one of these 3 could be a master's project for you if you're willing to get your feet wet. Alright guys, thanks for tuning in. Keep safe, keep healthy, and keep learning.